Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the 9th in the Back to Business series of 12 webinars, offering practical tips to help you rebuild on the back of recent bushfire, drought, floods and storms. My name is Megan Rogers, and I'm Manager of Sheep Connect New South Wales, Australian Wool Innovations Extension Network in New South Wales. These webinars are hosted by Meat and Livestock Australia, Australian Wool Innovation, AWI Sheep Connect New South Wales, an Integrity Systems company with support from New South Wales DPI, New South Wales Local Land Services and New South Wales Farmers. Our weekly webinar every Tuesday at 1 p.m. offers insight, resources and support to help those impacted by recent events in getting back to business. If you are a regular attendee, you'll know the way that we have set these webinars up. But for those who are joining us for the first time, these webinars have been set up as standalone events, so we can directly email you the recording of each webinar an hour after it is finished. But what that does mean is that you'll need to register for each webinar individually. With that in mind, we've kept the registration process as streamlined and brief as possible, with just 3 additional questions over and above your contact details. To assist with this, you'll receive a registration link for next week's webinar in your email following today's webinar, along with the recording. Our webinar recordings are also posted on the Sheep Connect New South Wales website in the tools section, and that'll happen later today. Any handouts that we do share in webinars and important links will also be available with a corresponding recording on our website. We don't have any handouts for you today. I would also like to ask that you please answer the brief evaluation survey at the conclusion of today's webinar. Your feedback is very important, and all partnering organisations are keen to hear your feedback and are committed to providing services to you that are relevant, timely and most of all helpful to your business. So I would ask you to please take the time to answer 6 questions at the end of the webinar today. I'll just now run through the housekeeping for today's webinar. As you know, if you're a regular attendee, all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you can't see the control panel that's now on your screen, and hopefully we can all see my screen, if you can't see that little control panel there, click on that arrow. You'll find an arrow with a minimise control panel. Click on that there next to that big red arrow, and that'll expand that out. Ordinarily, we would have handouts that are available to download, but we don't have any handouts for you today. To ask a question, click on the little triangle next to the word questions, and that'll expand a little box there, and then type your question in where it says enter a question for staff. So we've got plenty of time for questions at the conclusion of today, and I'll collate all of those and they can be asked all together as a sort of question and answer discussion at the end of today's presentation. I now wanted to just launch a poll question, which will basically give us a couple of bits of feedback. Basically, it tells us who's joining us today and what your industry role is. And it also gives us the opportunity to understand that the platform's working and that you're able to see our screens and interact with us. So, yep, so it looks like we've got plenty of experienced pollsters on the webinar today. We've got 52% votes in so far. So I'll just leave that open for a little bit longer. I'll give another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'll close the poll. And now I'll share the results. So we've got about a quarter of you are sheep only, just under 20% are cattle only, the same with mixed species. We've got 33% advisors joining us today and 5% other. Thanks everyone for your patience. It does take a little while to get through our housekeeping, but it's important just so everybody's online and joining us and understanding where the question panes are. I'll now introduce today's presenter, Hamish Dixon. Hamish is a Principal Consultant for AgriPartner Consulting and has over 15 years experience in the agricultural industry, working in roles both on farm and off. Hamish has specialist knowledge of both extensive and intensive ruminant production systems and works in the industry through consulting, training and research in sheep and cattle nutrition and management. Also operates a farm in Central West New South Wales. And in happy news, he's welcomed a new addition to his family just last week, another baby boy. Congratulations, Hamish. And yeah, certainly I met Hamish, it seems like 1,000 years ago, when I was with the Department of Ag, and Hamish was involved in the feedlotting code of practice. So yeah, that was many moons ago. So welcome, Hamish, and I'll now hand over to you, and I'll start sharing your screen.
Okay, great.
Just coming through now. So I'll mute myself once you start your presentation, Hamish.
No problems at all. Alrighty, is that screen coming through for you now?
Sure is. Thank you.
And look, welcome everybody today. Look, some discussion on basically different options that might be available in the shorter term, given that the season has changed in some areas. And one of the things that I do want to be quite conscious of today as well, though, is that there are certainly areas of Australia that are, have had an incredible start to the season, and there are certainly also some areas that are still struggling. And the options and the short-term options that are available to us to try and capitalise on those types of opportunities might be quite different. So I'm going to go through a few scenarios that will hopefully at least get us thinking about whether there's some opportunities to grab in these sort of different seasons. So look, many of you may well be aware, you've seen the rainfall that's been coming through in some areas, and we can see the areas of Australia that are still certainly looking for a little bit more as well. But certainly in the last couple of months in particular, a fairly big area of Eastern Australia has had a fairly good turnaround, which is starting to open up some new opportunities, even in things as simple as looking like, agistment, which traditionally hasn't been as easy to come by as what it is now. So those sorts of opportunities can come back onto the radar, and it's how do we really work through the most effective way to determine whether that's the best opportunity to take, rather than potentially utilising our own grown feed or hand feeding if we might need to, or selling as well. So we'll certainly spend some time today having a look at the old traditional feed adjust sell scenario, and work through a couple of examples on that front that can, I guess, give you a bit of information about how we work through it with clients and how we work through it here ourselves. And then also certainly have a bit of discussion about some other little opportunities that might come up around adjusting management and things like calendar of operations, and are there some opportunities to move some of those things a little bit that that might just help capitalise on differences in this season to next or to last season as well. So we'll go through those sorts of options too. So certainly when we start to look into the feed adjust sell scenario, number one is if we're looking at feeding, it's how do we actually do this most effectively, and how do we actually make sure that whatever feeding we do is done most efficiently. And I think this is a really important discussion point to have, in that in the last few years where conditions have been really dry, I think we've spent a lot of time making sure that whatever feeding we do has been very considered and ensure that it's actually been fed to the most, or to the group of animals that provide the biggest cost benefit. And certainly what tends to happen is as soon as the season turns around, we get a little bit more relaxed with that decision-making process. But it is still important to make sure that whatever feeding we're doing, whether it's utilising our own grown feed or whether it's using full supplementary feeding programs, that we try and make sure that we always have a clear understanding in the back of our mind about who and which animals are the most cost effective to be feeding and when. And that's a simple ranking system. And if you've got that in your mind all the time, and a lot of you have it there intuitively anyway, but it gives us some guidance around really who are the animals that might be the priority to kick off into other options, like whether they're sold or whether they're sent on agistment. Who are the animals for the priority for those options first, versus those that are most critical to make sure that we look after the feeding 100% for them all the time, and more likely they're the ones that are going to stay home. So one of the important things when we're looking at that is how do we manage that feeding in terms of condition? And it may well be that there's different programs put in place for those that are in better condition compared to those that are in poorer condition. And the other discussion point that comes up quite often, especially if things are tight, is looking at how well do we manage condition in terms of targeting production versus just a maintenance level. And this has been a scenario that I think we've played with quite a lot in the last few years, in particular, again with the dry times. So this is probably one example, and this is one way that I think we can look at it in terms of the costs that are involved and what are the benefits in terms of two different strategies. If in this example, we'll take a sheep scenario, and if we say that we've got ewes coming up to joining time and they are in body condition score 2.7, right? Now, scenario A might be that you take the strategy of giving them some extra feeding, bring them up to score 3 and maintaining them there through lambing time. Okay, sort of giving them the feed that we want to give them that sort of optimal situation. Scenario B might be that you just let them do what the sheep do on whatever pastures you have available. Certainly they're not falling away into really very low condition scores, but they've slipped down to condition score 2.3 by the time they've got to lambing. Okay, so quite obviously in those two scenarios, two different feeding strategies, and obviously two different outcomes at the end of the day in terms of what you would expect from a production point of view. So you will all receive a copy of this presentation after today that will give you, an opportunity to go through these numbers and understand it a bit more if you like. But just to go over it for us at the moment, look, when we play around with these scenarios, we quite often do this to have a look at what the joined as an example, and we've got scenario and scenario B where they've been let to just gradually slide down to score 2.3 by lambing, then we're likely going to be expecting different conception rates out of those two groups of animals. Okay, and in this scenario, we've got 135% out of group A and 125% out of group B, with some difference in the proportions of dries as well. Okay, so we've got differences there. And for what we're doing here, we say, right, the dries are going to be sold. We've got some sale proceeds to factor in there. And then as we progress through the calendar of operations, we get closer to lambing time, we've got some differences in terms of what we see from a marking percentage point of view as well. Okay, so at marking, in terms of the overall marking percentage out of those two groups, we're marking about 103% out of group A and 85% out of group B. So obviously we've got sale proceeds coming through from stock there as well. That gives us the income side for part of that, but the other side to it obviously is costs, and we've got feed costs for group A that we don't in group B. And there's actually about $5,000 in feed for group A there to manage that additional body condition score and topping them up to score 3 there. And equally, the other thing that we need to be conscious of is we've actually sold off more dries out of group B, so we need more replacements to come back into the system to maintain our 1,000 head joining group. Okay, so there's more costs involved there. So at the end of the day, by the time you balance out the different factors that come into play, there's a $20,000 or over $20,000 benefit to maintaining the condition of those ewes and making that feeding strategy work in that farm. Now, many situations, this is, the numbers can vary depending on where you are and the amount of feeding that's required, but it gives you a process to actually look at how we could actually analyse that type of strategy and how it plays out. The other thing that isn't really factored in here is the fact that you need to think longer term about what's happened with group B in terms of their successive joining. They're down in condition, they need additional feed to come back up again prior to next joining to actually achieve a good conception rate at the following joining too. So there's some information there that gives us some guidance on how we manage that, and that's part of the strategy about if we're going to take a feeding perspective, who do we feed, how much do we feed, and to what level? Do we feed to production, do we feed to maintenance? And I think one rule to keep in mind is if you're going to make a decision to feed for production, it's really important to feed the right amount and feed fully. There's no point really trying to feed for production but only half doing it. It doesn't give us a good outcome. And equally, if we've got limited feed resources, often you end up being better off targeting two particular groups to make sure that they're fed well, and either getting rid of other groups or sending them off on agistment and looking after that agist or sell option. If we just try and stretch limited feed resources over all the animals and they're all fed at a suboptimal level, then we tend to get suboptimal results across the whole board, which is worse off than really targeting groups and making sure that they're looked after properly. One of the other things in terms of feeding and thinking about who and how we do it is what are we doing in terms of replacement stock coming through, and understanding really what is the growth path that those animals require. You know, how much feeding do they need to reach their joining weights? How much feeding do they need to make sure that they're fed for pregnancy if they're getting joined? All of those things are pretty important to make sure that we can clearly identify exactly how much feed goes out to different groups and allocate all of those resources. One of the other things that starts to come into play when we're looking at feeding is, especially with young stock, where we're actually looking at the costs of maintenance and the costs of pregnancy, is thinking about when they're joined. And there's an overhead cost that's involved in any operation, any breeding operation anyway, that comes with having stock at maintenance. And we need to be really conscious of how much cost is involved in actually feeding animals at just a maintenance level versus trying to achieve some production out of them. And a really good example of this is if we're looking at the total energy requirements of, say, twin-bearing ewes. So over the course of the year, when you look at the total energy cost for maintenance, so just the energy required for the bare essential physiological functions of that ewe, 2/3 of that energy is going into just maintenance. Okay, and that is effectively an overhead cost to your operation. It's there whether you like it or not. And like any other overhead in a business, the way that you try and offset that overhead is trying to offset it with production. So you want to try and make sure that that ewe is growing plenty of wool, or she's rearing lambs to offset that overhead cost. So the actual additional energy cost for supporting pregnancy and supporting lactation is actually quite a lower proportion than what maintenance is. So quite often I see these scenarios, and especially if things can get tight, sometimes we think we'll just rein them back to maintenance, but you need to be very careful about where those costs compare when there's actually a relatively low amount of cost involved in supporting the pregnancy and lactation. Those sorts of scenarios where we can support good level of feeding to support lambing or calving all the way through will change depending on market prices. And I think in the last few years, we've seen those decisions change to the point where lots of enterprises are targeting. But if you go back many years where potentially feed prices were high, that equation may be quite different. So we need to make sure that you look at these costs quite clearly within your own enterprise as well. When you start to look at the feeding costs, one other thing that's actually really important just to look at is how we actually analyse what feeds are most cost effective in a system. And one way of looking at that is making sure that we understand what the feed cost is per megajoule of energy and equally per kilo of protein. When you're designing your supplementary feeding rations, or you're looking at the value of pastures versus total mixed rations or supplementary feeding rations, it's good to really know the relative costs of each. And you can start to see that you can compare things like cereal grains to straws to hays when you've got information on what the feed cost is per megajoule. And in this example, you can see that realistically, some of our cheapest feed is pastures, and you can see by how big a factor they are. They are so much cheaper than anything that you feed by hand, and what's not included in these costs is your labour in terms of actually feeding out as well. But pastures are clearly so much cheaper. That's why we try and make sure we utilise them as much as we can. But one of the things you've also got to be careful of is if you look at straw, for example, the feed cost per megajoule of energy is actually quite cheap. But the practical reality is, over the top of that, you physically can't feed enough to actually meet requirements of many animals either. But it allows you, this process allows you one way to work through and really compare differences. And for example, you can certainly see that if what you're chasing is an energy-rich feed, cereal grains compared to legume grains are by far and away a much better way to go. But if you're trying to chase protein in the system, then legume grains start to come into play as well. If you start to extrapolate that information out, and we start to look at how those different options play out over over a longer period of time, then you can start to see that if we're looking at an example of sheep with ewes in mid-pregnancy, you're looking at a cost of, say, 56 cents per head per day on a full hand-fed total mixed ration. Compare that to pastures back at 10 cents per head per day. Okay, so the costs are obviously quite different. And this is why, as much as possible, we utilise those pastures wherever we can. And then comparatively, when we start to look at cattle, cows mid-pregnancy, maybe a calf at foot still, up around $4 per head per day, versus pasture cost back down at 70 cents per head per day. Okay, and these costs can be calculated for yourself once you have a look at what class of animal am I looking at feeding options for, what are their requirements in terms of energy and potentially protein, and then working through, right, how much do I have to feed? What's the cost per head per day? Might then take it out to say, what's the cost per week, per month, however long you're trying to look at your feeding strategy for over time. So if you've got an understanding of these costs of feeding, particularly where it's on your own place, then you start to then put yourself in a position where you can then review your next options that are available to you that might be adjustment. And if you can see that you've got some adjustment available, then you start to review whether it's a potential fit for your enterprise or not. And I think this year we've seen a big jump up in adjustment availability. Traditionally, I think especially if you're in a situation where you're in a feed deficit and things are tight, often adjustment just isn't available because everyone in your region's in the same boat. They're struggling for feed. They certainly haven't got plentiful feed available for stock. This year, different story. Big change in the season in big parts of Eastern Australia. Not a lot of stock for many places because they're coming out of the back of drought, and equally, pretty expensive stock to be buying in. So many places aren't actually in the position to be buying up and stocking up and using a lot of that feed themselves. So adjustment may well be their second best option. So if you've got stock that you can potentially put away on adjustment, it may be an opportunity to look at. The things to be looking at is, well, which animals are we going to be doing it with, and considering, well, is it maybe some of the animals that are going to be going away on sale, right? So are there finishing stock that you can send, so that maybe it's a one-way trip? Do you have young weaners that have got to go off for sale and they can go somewhere on adjustment that might even be en route to the abattoir that they're going to end up eventually? In that way you can start to manage maybe some of the biosecurity risks that come with adjustment if you don't know the property that they're going to. Maybe it's some terminal groups, some groups of animals or ewes or cows that are joined, particularly ewes that are joined to a terminal sire, so that if something does go wrong on the property or you find that there's a health issue that comes up, well, they're not your top genetics that you really want to make sure can come back to your property in the first place. So you can think about those sorts of considerations when you are trying to work through, right, well, which group of animals may well be best suited to adjustment in the first place. Obviously, the quality of feed at the adjustment property is a big part of that factor too. Does it suit, growing animals? Does it suit only dry animals? And looking at those components of it. With adjustment, certainly you need not just the adjustment rate, but obviously the management at the same time. We've sort of touched on biosecurity, but certainly make sure that you're aware of any biosecurity risks that are involved. Make sure any health of stock is up to speed before they go away, so that you haven't got any issues with trying to get stock into yards while they're away on adjustment if you need to. And one thing is think about written agreements for adjustment. It's no different to leasing land. Lots of adjustment now is getting written up into simple agreements in many instances, and it may just be ensuring that everyone's on the same page for the expected duration of the adjustment. Certainly it costs. It's something that you can put in terms of making sure everyone's on the same page as to who's checking stock. What is the process if there's some deaths at the property, or any of those considerations that are important to put into a written agreement, mostly so that you can make sure you have that discussion and everyone's on the same page. So from the cost point of view, by the time we start to compare those options, we looked at the cost before of a full hand-fed TMR ration for cows versus pasture. And then if you look at something like agistment coming into the fold, then it starts to give us some guide here around really, well, what is the comparative cost between the three options? Okay, and certainly agistment can be very cost effective compared to hand feeding. So if we're in a situation where there is limited feed available on your property and you're certainly looking to try and hold on to some stock in the longer term, then agistment may well come into play as one opportunity to be looking at. If not, then you start to play with the sell option. Okay, and it's just then looking at, well, who do we actually potentially sell first? Which ones are our first ones to consider? And obviously dryers come into play. So it may well be those that have come through a preg scanning, so those that have failed to conceive, and it may well also be an opportunity to look at dryers that have been sold or that can be sold at weaning time, so those that have failed to rear progeny as well. Well, you might be able to identify those at marking as well. So looking at where there's opportunities for some of those animals to be sold is pretty important. The other component is thinking about, well, from an age group point of view, if you need to be looking at a cohort like that, then who goes? And this is more often, obviously a situation in really tight conditions, and we've got areas of Australia that are still like that. But an important thing to be thinking about, is it the oldest age group that go, or is it the youngest? And I think often we tend to flick off the oldest age group because they're the easiest. We think they're getting towards the end of their life. And certainly if there are, if they are old and they're not sound in the mouth, they're not sound structurally, they haven't been producing, then certainly they're an easy group to get rid of. But the other consideration is think about, as a short-term strategy, those animals actually have been well proven potentially as breeders in the flock or the herd over their lifetime to this point already. And if they are still sound in the mouth, they're still sound structurally, they're in good condition, that group of animal is actually probably one of the most productive animals on the farm and might be an animal to actually retain, and some of the younger stock could well be a good group of animals to be sold instead. Obviously the trade-off is, and one of the reasons sometimes we think about trying to keep our younger stock, is potentially they have the better genetics. Okay, and whilst that might be true, I think often in that situation we need to have a really honest, long, hard look at how much genetic gain we're making year on year. And if it isn't a major consideration, then the fact is that those youngest animals that are still potentially doing some growing are some of our higher cost animals to maintain in the system as well. So there may be an opportunity to actually offload some of those younger ones that will likely also achieve a higher price, but you need to think about really what are the trade-offs in that scenario. And obviously in the longer term, you can't continue doing that strategy year on year on year. But as a short-term option, maybe there's a balance of some of those groups that can be considered. Selling stock, certainly young stock are the other groups that we start to look at as to whether we can sell them early. Maybe they go into a restocker market, or do you finish them? And certainly if agistment comes up as an option, the third option is, do you finish them yourself or do you finish them somewhere else on agistment? So some of the process, I guess, that we can look at when we're looking at this scenario is if we say in this scenario we're looking at lambs, let's say for argument's sake we've got a lamb that's 38 kilos, it's worth $155 in the market. If you were to sell it, you've got some selling costs involved. Let's say that brings it back to netting you $147. So that's kind of your starting point of, if I was to offload that animal right now, that's where we're at. The next option is, do you finish it on farm? Now we're assuming in this scenario that we're looking at selling stock because we haven't got enough paddock feed. So in reality, the option is that if we're going to retain it, it has to go into a feedlot. Now, cost-wise, look, everyone's slightly different, but in many scenarios, for what we're looking at here, there's probably $40 a head in feed. By the time you factor in labour, health, selling costs, there's a total of somewhere around $50 per head. If that lamb grows out, you've got a 25 kilo dollars. So by the time you factor in your costs, effectively, you're no better off. Okay, and in fact, we're $5 behind where we could have been. So we've lost that amount there. So you might as well, in that sort of scenario, start to look at alternative options. The next one is if we've got agistment available to us, then maybe that's something that we can look at. Agistment, cost-wise, you've got about $13.50 in agistment, plus some costs for checking, health, selling, all those sorts of things. Let's say that brings it up to a bit over $26. Same sort of thing with, by the time you factor in the income side, in this scenario, there's a net position of $18 or $18.50. So in that scenario, that may well be enough additional income for you to justify making that step and doing that process yourself. Everyone will have slightly different value points where they cut in and out of these decisions. For some people, they might make the decision to use agistment if they can make an additional $10 per head. Other people might not even look at agistment as an option unless they can add another $30 per head. Okay, everyone is slightly different on that, but the process to work through that is pretty important in terms of just being able to play out each of those options and understand which is the best one, best opportunity to take. And certainly when you're looking at these options, each of them have some different cash flow considerations as well as to when you need the cash. Certainly if you're looking at the feedlot scenario, not only have you not sold those animals yet, but you've got a reasonably significant cost in terms of feed to be buying in, and also some of those sale costs are obviously much higher as well at that point. So thinking about the cash flow considerations are part of those decisions too. One of the other things that I think is useful to discuss when we are looking at short-term management options is not just the traditional sort of feed, adjust, sell scenario, but are there some sort of calendar of operations type adjustments or opportunities that we can look at as well? And one is looking at joining date. So one of the things that we often can tweak a little bit is when we put bulls or the rams out. Now, obviously in most areas, we have a fairly defined or traditional or targeted joining date that suits for a whole lot of reasons. It may well be to utilise pasture as effectively as we can. It might be to target a particular market with the progeny that are going to be arriving later in the year. But one of the things to think about is there an opportunity to move that joining date slightly? And in this sort of scenario, look, really, we're talking about moving it by maybe 2 or up to 4 weeks. And we're not talking about massive wholesale changes. They're a bigger decision. But in this scenario, if you can see that the forecasts are looking like there's going to be continued feed availability, and we've had an awesome break to the season, maybe you do think about, can you bring that joining date a little bit earlier? Make sure that we utilise the feed that we've got. Maybe it allows us to make sure that, you know, the weaners have good feed quality to be finished off on. You can consider all of those sorts of opportunities coming through. And likewise, in a poorer season, it may well be a scenario of, well, maybe there's an opportunity to push joining date back a couple of weeks. You know, what does that affect on the other side? And certainly there's considerations around making sure that where that move takes us doesn't then clash with other things. You know, for many mixed enterprises, obviously joining dates have to fit, or particularly lambing and weaning and those major activities have to ideally fit around some of our other activities that fit from a cropping point of view. You know, we don't want to move something to the stage where we're then clashing with harvest or we're clashing with seeding, and potentially we're not running either system as best as we can. Management of dries we've sort of talked about, and certainly selling those dries can be one option. Obviously that's a really positive thing from a cash flow point of view. We've got them right there, they're sold, we've got cash in the bank. The other option is that if we have those dries and we've had a good season and we've got plenty of feed, then maybe it does open up an opportunity to rejoin them. Now, this sort of goes back, I think, to the very first comments around feeding and making sure that we understand who are the priorities to make sure feed is provided to. And certainly our core breeding animals have to always be number one. And we don't ever want to be in the place where we are, you know, using feed for remated dries that should have been allocated to our core breeding herd or flock as well. But if we've got excess feed and we can look at, you know, an opportunity of remating some of those dries, then that might be an opportunity to look at. And obviously you can then either potentially sell those animals as pregnant, you know, scanned in, or maybe you can take them all the way through and actually carve them down or lamb. Those two options will be something that you can continue to play with over time as well. You know, in many situations, if we've got dries, we can see that we've got feed, you might rejoin them, and then as you get to the point where scanning's happened, you then make the decision, depending on how the seasonal forecasts are looking at that stage, your feed budgets, about whether those animals are sold, you know, in calf or in lamb, or whether you take them all the way through yourself. The other thing to be thinking about with dries is whether you just run them as a dry. And particularly certainly for merinos, you know, that may well be a good option in terms of just carrying them through as a dry animal, at very least until next shearing. So if you can look at it from a cost point of view, it might well be the weather. The other option when we have, you know, particularly where we've had good feed for a while and young stock have grown well, and particularly for sheep more so, if we're looking at joining new lambs, then that might be one other opportunity to be looking at grabbing for this season. Now, is there a way that we've got, or if we've come out of a situation where our ewe lambs have grown really well, they're starting to look like they're tracking towards hitting target weights for joining, which for sheep, we're looking at 80% of the standard reference weight, right? So if they've hit that 80% of standard reference weight by the time you want to join them, then we're potentially in a good situation to achieve a good conception rate. So that might be one other way of looking at really using some of the opportunities around a better season like we've had in many areas. If that's the case, we just have to make sure that we also make sure we look after those animals, not just to get them into a positive place at joining time, but we make sure that they are looked after all the way through pregnancy, because those animals are trying to support a fetus, a growing fetus, but they are also trying to still grow themselves. So they've got higher demand. So we've got to be able to look after them all the way through their pregnancy and all the way leading back up to their next joining as well, to make sure we continue to get a good result out of those animals. And I think probably the other thing to be putting on the radar at the moment too is that, especially in areas where we've obviously got an excess of feed, is don't forget about just conserving some feed. You know, we've come out of a number of years where we've utilised whatever feed resources we have around. You know, a lot of the hay sheds are quite low, grain resources are low. It may well be an opportunity to park some feed and put it away as a resource and as a store for future dry seasons as well. So that may well be something to put on the radar for this coming season, as well as a short-term opportunity to grab. So I think really, in terms of just some key messages, look, the varying seasons that we've had, there's always opportunities to capitalise on ways to make the most out of the season, and that may well be in feeding and in management. But it's really important to know the cost benefit of feeding each group. You know, whenever we're looking at that feeding scenario, ensure that we know really who are the priorities, what's the cost benefit of feeding them, to make sure that we justify any strategy that we're going to apply. Certainly adjustment opportunities may well be available this year. Throw them into the mix in terms of a possible opportunity to tackle amongst the usual feeding versus selling options. And I think also have a look at the opportunities in terms of varying, you know, whatever the normal calendar of operations looks like as well, and seeing if there's any opportunities to make use of the conditions that we've got at the moment. So Megan, I think with that, I'll hand back over to you, and happy to take any questions in time as well.
Thanks, Hamish. Certainly lots and lots of key pieces of information that are important for us as we look to really try and ramp up the production from our livestock program. Just wanted to let everybody know that we've now got some time for questions, and they're just starting to come in. So start typing those in that little question pane, and we'll start answering those. I guess one of the first questions relates to some backcountry, like so out in a pastoral area, and you talked a little bit about joining young stock and some of the strategies for rejoining dries. I know that quite a few people out there use as a flock rebuilding strategy to put the rams out and double join and try and get to lots of lambs, either in, you know, 3 lots of lambs in 2 years, or, you know, even just get some opportunistic out of season lambs. Hamish, I know that you've had a fair bit of experience in that pastoral country. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, it's not necessarily a bad idea, and in many opportunities there are ways to do that. It's probably the really key considerations though are just making sure that if they're going to be looking at extra matings, then just ensure that the timing is still controlled to some degree, so you don't get major clashes with you know, key mustering times, shearing times, lambing in peak summer conditions or something like that just can really undo any of the benefits that you're going to achieve in the first place. So there are certainly opportunities to do that. Even in the short-term side of things, look, there's opportunities with many pastoral places where potentially rams are out. Certainly in many pastoral operations, the rams just come, they're removed from the flock again once it's shearing time, or maybe once peak scanning comes around. In that scenario, there are certainly opportunities in terms of trying to just remake dries in that situation. If you can do that, it gives you a lot better control over lambing groups as well. So I think, as much as possible, try and separate any of those groups that you try. Roughly who's going to be lambing when. If you just get messy as to knowing who's lambing when and trying to manage marking and trying to manage all the usual operations.
Yeah, we just lost you there for a little while. It just dropped out. But basically the gist of what you were saying was just, not complicating the situation too much, bearing in mind what you've got ahead of you in terms of key production times and key muster times or key operations in your system, and then keeping a track of who's who and who's doing what and when and that kind of thing. And obviously trying to avoid some of those seasonal extremes. Yeah,
that's right. And it was just the only point I think I was made there, maybe at the end where it dropped out, was just if you've got opportunities to be able to, certainly more pastoral places are scanning these days. If you've got an opportunity to target that remating to dries, then obviously it helps a lot, because then who's going to be at a later lambing date, rather than having just a really mixed group that's coming through with lambs or calves dropping at any point.
It's a good idea. I guess, for some people who might have been autumn joining, there's a strategy there that, depending on where they did put the rams in with their ewes, the ewes may or may not have been on a rising plane of nutrition and may not have necessarily joined really well. So it's a really strong case for making sure that you do scan, and then that giving you the opportunity to make some adjustments if the ewes hadn't joined as well as you would have hoped. Just with that change of feed, or if the feed hadn't actually started to get away when the rams were out and the ewes were maybe doing a little bit tougher. So a really good case for making sure that you're scanning and measuring what's going on in your flock. Lisa's asked us a question with regards to the benefit cost figures that you had before. And she wants to know whether you've got the cost benefit figures for ewes joined at condition score 2.7 and maintained at 2.7 for lambing, rather than production feeding them up to condition score 3.
Look, I mean, we can certainly work through that scenario. So one of the resources that you can look at to do that is if you go to a lot of the lifetime wool outcomes that have been obviously pushed through and lifetime ewe management program that's out there, those have the relationships between condition and lamb survival, or even back to conception rate at joining time. So you can use that information to actually calculate a lot of those cost benefits yourself. So happy to certainly have a chat afterwards, and we can sort of have a look at that as a scenario. But effectively, if you're looking to as a way to try and do that yourself, use those sorts of resources. We have really great resources available in the industry already, and I think probably in some ways we just don't utilize them well enough. So those resources are there. You can look at if we have ewes that are in condition score 2.7 and they are held at that level from joining all the way through to lamb survival. There's some really good baseline data that's sitting there, and some good relationship curves that you'll be able to see, what the lamb survival rates are like, and do your cost benefits that way too.
Thanks, Hamish. That kind of leads us on to our next question from Terry. And I know that you've probably partly answered Terry's question, but Terry's wondering if there's a resource, i.e. a web page, where he can get estimates of animal requirements for protein and energy when hand feeding. There's something online.
Yep, so jump on there. So all of the lifetime ewe management resources will give you the energy requirements of stock. Have a look on there. Obviously also have a look at making more from sheep for the stock side. Cattle have certainly more beef and pastures. There's some resources in there, and both of those will provide information energy and protein requirements. And then there's a number of, I guess, publications as well from both AWI, MLA, that can provide basically the background on how to formulate some of those diets and requirements of stock. Yeah, we can perhaps circulate a list of some of those when the recording goes out.
Actually, we popped together a quite a substantial list of feeding resources for one of our webinars a few weeks back. It was the Grow More Feed one. Sorry, my apologies. It was the livestock nutrition and feeding options during rebuild on the 28th of April. Yep. I'll pop that up as a resource with this recording as well, so that it's not too difficult for you to track down, Terry. But certainly all of our Back to Business webinars are recorded, and the recordings are online along with the handouts. So sheepconnectnsw.com.au is where you'll find those.
Yeah, so that sounds like a perfect situation to be able to go back to that one and go over that information. That sounds good.
Yeah, we compiled a lot of those common tools because obviously we weren't going to be able to provide them all as handouts. So there's live links on that document. It's a PDF document, so that's all available there. Lisa's just added a comment here that the New South Wales drought feeding app is excellent. Yeah, there's some really, I'm not sure whether you've got a smartphone, Terry, but certainly if you do, yeah, download that one. It's certainly widely used and quite applicable to different types of livestock and different classes, i.e. whether they're pregnant, dry, young, etc. Keep the questions coming, people. I guess one thing that you talked about, and I think you've covered it, but I just wanted to revisit, is just a little bit about tweaking some of your key dates when you're going through a recovery process. That, again, giving yourself a little bit of extra time to allow you use to respond to the green feed, or allow cows to respond to the green feed before you're putting bulls or rams out, is a good strategy. And it doesn't necessarily need to cause you to have to rethink the entire calendar of operations for your program, does it, Hamish?
No, that's right. And I think, particularly for, look, we've had, I think, probably a number of people that have come out of bushfires, and in many situations when you're coming out of particularly disaster scenarios like that, then often you're scrambling to get everything reorganized into a different calendar to make the system suit. And in those scenarios, look, it is worth just making sure that you be flexible on what you're doing and when. It's not worth trying to make animals that are under in condition to where you want them, when you know that if with a couple of weeks work, you'll get them in a much better position. They'll be getting effectively a flush, and you're going to get a much better result. Think about not being overly rigid on some of those dates if it's going to have a really negative effect or long-term effect on the production side. So there's ways to move those sorts of things around. And like I say, even in normal seasons, some small movements here and there that can just allow ways of just really taking a little bit more opportunity out of those seasons can be really beneficial. Might be, and we don't want the season to shut off, but you never know how things play out. And I think we're seeing in a lot of parts of Australia much shorter springs. And if we've had a great start, then if you move joining maybe a week or two earlier, if it suits for a whole lot of other aspects throughout the year, then maybe it's one way of reducing the risk of a short spring in that season. It's just something to think about, and it's it should always be on the radar to work on those sorts of things. And clearly, there's always trade-offs. Maybe in some situations you don't want to be lambing in the dead of winter, but just think about, are there ways of juggling those sorts of things to give us a better outcome?
Thanks for that. And I guess if there's a free kick in there, have a bit of an idea that there might be a free kick available for you, and taking those free kicks, if it's not going to change your calendar of operations too substantially, there's some opportunity there. And particularly, I guess, for those who are still finding the seasonal conditions pretty tough, and I know that there are still some areas that haven't received general and follow-up rain. So, you know, there's still some opportunities there for people to, you know, continue with a little bit of adaptive management to try and cash in again on some opportunities, or limit the negative that comes out from some of those as well.
Yeah.
Got a couple more questions. Coming in. And it's a little bit around what my last point was. Emma's just said that they haven't had much rain yet, and do you think it's better to feed and join or leave them unjoined for the year?
I think a lot of that comes back to really knowing that maintenance versus production cost. So I think in many situations at the moment, even with, I think the slight challenges that we've got in the markets at the moment price-wise, it's been pretty well a positive thing to make sure we still chase production and still join and feed. But you know, you've got to say with that you've got to do those numbers yourself, because that's one of the big decisions to make. I think when you go back many years and stock weren't worth much and feed costs were almost comparative to what they were now, then you know, feeding for just maintenance, you know, almost just survival, was a very different scenario to what it is now. With stock prices and even wool prices where they are, there may well still be opportunities and good opportunity to feed when you think about the relative cost or the relative total amount of energy and or protein that's used to support that pregnancy compared to the big proportion that's just going still into maintenance. It's a bigger cash flow consideration because you've still got to provide that extra feed, but equally you've got, you know, production coming out the other side in terms of lambs or calves. I didn't know whether she's talking about cattle or sheep there, but either side there's a production outcome there that needs to be factored in. It does also go back to one important thing is, if you make to feed and join and go all the way through, make sure that you feed them well all the way through that pregnancy. Because if you limit the feed on those animals and they're slipping in condition, we're going to see that same effect where we're not getting a good lamb survival rate, calf survival rate, marking outcome out the other side. And there's no real point in terms of having to go on down that strategy in the first place. So, you know, I think one of the things is don't go in half-hearted if you're going to take a production feeding mindset. Certainly feed the right amount. There's no point overfeeding either, but don't do it half-heartedly. And I see that sometimes, and it often can come unstuck. You know, you get a poor result and you've still had a fair proportion of the cost sitting there with not a lot of offset for those costs.
Wise words there, Hamish, and particularly with regards to doing some solid feed budgeting, you know, just because, you know, some people may be sort of entering into some, you know, a bit of green pasture, still understanding how much pasture and whether any supplementation is required. You know, because at the end of the day, a cost to your business is to, you know, be managing breeding ewes, you know, for all of that period of time, and for them to turning up to lamb marking without a lamb, whether that be to, you know, joining failures or other management issues surrounding pregnant lambing ewes, is another cost to your business that, you know, with a little bit of astute management and some careful planning can avoid some, you know, deficits in income, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the other thing there is it also, I think, adds weight to the positives around actually starting to get a good understanding on the productivity of animals. You know, if you're not preg scanning animals and you don't know, you know, who have actually been consistently at least getting in lamb, maybe not rearing lambs, but at the very least, you know, if you know who are the productive animals in the flock and those that are less productive, then the other opportunity is, if you have that data, then it may well be, if the feed budgets are showing that it's going to be tight this season, then it's a case of dropping numbers a bit, you know, and if you know who are the most productive animals, then you can identify them and keep them. And likewise, you can actually get rid of the lower productive animals, and not only make your feed budget stack up a little bit better, but also ensure that if you are having to still supplementary feed to lead up to joining and potentially all the way through pregnancy, at least you know that you're feeding the animals that are most likely to give you a good return.
Thanks, Hamish. We've got another question just with regards to fodder conservation. And can you suggest like some rules of thumb, proportion of feeds that I might conserve to fill up my hay sheds for future proofing? It's another one from Emma.
Yep. I think one of the first things is feed budgeting kind of leads into this in many ways, and understanding what type of feeds you traditionally use to suit your production cycle and your environment. And I think in many situations it's dictated a little bit by your enterprise. You know, we tend to see more often than not, you know, a higher proportion of grains used in sheep than cattle operations. So traditionally cattle, you know, there's you know, bigger reserves of hay put aside for their production systems than grain, and the reverse a little bit in sheep. The reasons for that we can discuss later, but it's also, I think, important just to know in a normal seasonal cycle how many tons of feed are you using, and then you can play out the scenario of in a drought year, how much do we need? And I think in many situations, basically what we're looking at is trying to ensure that we have generally 2 years up your sleeve. Everyone's different. We see some people want to try and stock away, you know, 3 to 4 years of feed, but many situations people are trying to ensure that they've got reserves that can get them through for up to 2 years. But part of that is your risk profile and how you manage droughts. There are a number of publications around on that can walk you through the calculations and the relative costs of storing versus, you know, buying at drought type prices. That's part of the business management side of things, is the fact that you know, some people will not have any reserves tucked away and just wear the fact that they're going to have to pay high prices typically during a dry time, versus, you know, other people with a different risk profile wanting to store away, you know, quite a substantial amount of feed, and ensure that they don't have to be exposed in that way. But yeah, typically I think the starting point is ensure that you work through your feed budgets and understand really what types of feed are used most in your enterprise, which types of feed potentially also are most cost effective to store. So certainly hay, obviously a lower bulk density, you obviously need more area, more shed capacity to store a feed like that. And I think particularly with sheep, we tend to get more back into grains as an option. And typically with sheep, we're generally chasing energy, so it tends to come back onto cereal grains more so than legumes. But you know, if first step is do your feed budgets, and that feed is required and when, and the proportions of each type.
Just getting a couple of little pauses there from you, Hamish, but the general point that Hamish has made is to, you know, do your feed budgets and understand how much feed you need for a desired period of time, and, you know, specify a feeding period in that feed budget rather than just having a bit of a, you know, vague idea of how much, you know, you might need for a month or a week or something like that. Have it as part of your strategy for business, building business resilience.
Yep, spot on.
Got a couple of more questions, and we'll just start wrapping up. It's just about 2 o'clock. Just can you just quickly run us back through? Michael sent through a question. Can you quickly run us through your preferred culling option with regards to age or productivity? And there's a bit of a typo there, just with regards to, you know, how many lambs that you may have had. So just, you know, which ones are the passengers and which ones are doing their work.
More performance, yeah, that's right. So I think it is important to try and, well, I think the first step is we've got to capture that data, and that's something that we're getting better at as an industry, but I think we certainly need to put some importance on making sure that we capture the information on which animals are performing in the flock and which ones aren't. So to do that, certainly, say if we're talking about culling procedures with sheep, then, you know, preg scanning results are an easy one. It may well also be related back to fleece value, particularly obviously in a merino type system. So from a culling order point of view, certainly we tend to look at those, so obviously dries, and going back to that order of importance, if you've got an opportunity to do a cull based on dries, then that can be done straight away at potentially preg scanning, or equally if you've got to the point where you're coming back around to marking or weaning time, there's your next opportunity to get some animals there at the same time. If you've got historical data on those animals, so for preg scanning, for example, if you know their historical preg scanning rates for however many years prior, then you may want to bring that into that decision as well. So if you've got a big group of dries that you don't necessarily want to get rid of all of them, then if you've got the data sitting there, you can go back through and you can identify those that have been dry, you know, for 2 out of the preceding 3 or 4 years versus those that's their first time they've been dry. So if you've got that data, you can work through that culling process in a much more objective way and really effectively cull that. So I'll look at that, and the other component is within that group, you might start to bring in that age consideration too. So there's 2 parts to it. One is maybe if you're still looking at dries as the first cohort to go, well, maybe within the dries, then you start to look at the younger ones. Because if you've been preg scanning previously and you've been managing your dries, presumably the older ones, it's their first time that they've come into that dry group, and more than likely you've got a high proportion of young ones in there anyway. So you might just take the young stock that have been dry in that scenario and cull those for and long term from a lifetime productivity perspective, but also the reality is they're more than likely to generate a better return. They're going to, you know, bring a better amount per head when they reach sale as well. So those sorts of things, yeah, be looking at it that way.
That was a good question, Michael, and thanks, Hamish, for answering it. I guess if I'm running cows and I'm a cattle-based operation, the same sort of scenario applies in terms of managing your animals. Like you've got a you know, obviously the calendar of operations is vastly different, but again, managing reproduction in those females is a really important part of making sure that your business and that enterprise is resilient going forward. You got any tips that you wanted to add just from a cattle perspective relating to Michael's question?
Yeah, look, I mean, the same sort of process can apply. I think we look, I mean, speaking generally, I think as an industry, we probably don't hold as much good reproductive data on cattle in a commercial herd point of view. If you are, that's great, and I think that's a really good thing to be doing, because you can apply the exact same rules. And generally, you know, it's with, you know, a herd of cows, typically lower numbers obviously than sheep. You know, we've got an easier way of capturing that data. So I think same thing, you know, if we've got ewes that cows that aren't conceiving, then we can identify that and we can track that through. And you know, and that leads into a little bit, I think, obviously, you know, cattle they've got to have an EID tag. So, you know, it's one way of actually utilising that resource that should be there. And I think probably unfortunately we see too many cattle that just get tagged on the way out, when in fact, you know, for the breeders, there's an opportunity there to use a lot of these culling decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just dropped out there. Look, I've got two more questions to go. And one of them is a little bit about, you know, the cost of feeding all stock for full production, and, you know, just with regards to joining a proportion of ewe base to get some replacements through the system, and sort of, you know, run some breeding ewes as dries, you know, sort of in a weather type operation, just to maintain numbers for when the season does improve a little bit, and what your thoughts are on that.
So how would you tackle that? So look, yes, you could look at that as a strategy. You would have to make sure, I think, if you're going to only join just enough to generate sufficient replacements coming through, you'd want to know that the animals that you're joining are pretty productive, because I would be hesitant in that. I reckon by the time you did the numbers, provided you could back it up with cash flow, you'd nearly be better off just going for production. It'd be an interesting one to do the numbers on. So I think realistically, if you've got limited feed resources in the paddock and you can run some stock on dry feed, if you are able to offset the costs that way, I would think that you're probably pretty close to being able to look at running a full joining. If you had to lock them up entirely and full containment feed all the way through, sure, in that scenario, you may well look to rein those numbers back to just enough to really produce your replacements. Because if you're in that sort of a situation, realistically, you still want feed in the paddocks, whether it's just dry residual feed, to be able to lamb down. So yeah, I think it probably depends a little bit on your situation, in that if you've got some feed in paddock but it's limited, I think you'd want to do your numbers pretty closely, and you might be able to join the lot. But if you were back to, really core drought conditions and there's really nothing in the paddock and you've got to full feed everything, sure, you might look at just joining enough to produce some replacements and get you through. But yeah, you'd be on the edge there. I think you'd want to do those numbers very carefully to work through it. And at the moment, the big part with that is probably some sensitivity analysis to make sure that you understand at what market prices, that decision changes, because that's probably one of the things that's a little challenging at the moment, is the uncertainty in the market. So just being sure or being aware of, right, if meat prices move from $8 down to $7, well, how much does that change that decision? It might be a little bit, it might be a lot. It's important to know that.
Doing a really solid set of figures on that's really important in terms of, the risk associated with joining and indeed not joining. So yeah, I guess in that scenario, it'd be worthwhile making yourself available to the Back to Business consulting program that MLA are currently running out across the country, and in the fire affected areas. That's very much available to people to get some one-on-one sessions with local consultants to help them in that regard. But really importantly, the amount of investment in terms of getting somebody, if you're drought impacted and not fire impacted, is certainly something, to have that information so that you're going into a scenario dealing with that risk with eyes wide open, with options in place and a bit of an exit strategy as well. Just one last question, and it's from Michael. So it's just flowing on from that culling question that he asked before, and I don't think this will take you a hell of a long time to answer. If you don't have EIDs and you're in a pastoral operation, how do you go about applying culling decisions when you don't have EIDs and no individual animal data in terms of keeping your productive animals?
It certainly makes it hard to really track a lot of that information through. But in saying that, you don't need EID for everything. So, come marking time, then you can still wet dry without an EID. So there's some opportunities in those sorts of situations. You've just got to also watch, that's what can be complicated by, extended joining periods or trying to get multiple joinings in there. Obviously, if you haven't got a reasonably tight lambing window, then it makes it a bit more difficult to, wet dry in that type of scenario. But yeah, you just really, all you can do is you can look for whatever traits and whatever. That's essentially it. So you come down to some of those things, or
we've just lost you again then, Hamish, but I guess just in terms of summarising, that there is to, if you've got a finite joining period, wet and drying at lamb marking time. And, I know that, putting a notch out of the back of like the ewe's ear as somebody who's come through without a follower is a good strategy, so that then if you see them again or you need to be reducing your numbers, there's the opportunity that they're permanently identified as ones that have turned up to the lamb marking cradles without any lambs. So I guess that was the gist of that comment.
Yep. And some people who are preg scanning without EID may well, put a disc in the tag or notch or whatever else as well for potentially twinners, or dries equally as well. So there's non-EID ways of doing that. EID just makes some of those processes a bit easier, that's all.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for your questions. We've had a stack of questions come through, and I think that's really testament to the quality of presentation that you've given us today, Hamish.
Thank you.
So I just again wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. And certainly I've found the questions and the discussion at the end of today's webinar equally as interesting and informative as the content that you've presented, Hamish. So thanks again. No doubt helpful to those who've joined us today. Thanks to everybody who's joined us today, and our producers and advisors. We're pleased with the number of attendees who have attended today. And just a couple of final reminders. We've got the 6 short questions, which are extremely important to us in terms of what you thought of today, but also what future topics and how the partnering organisations can help your business and help you get back to business. The evaluations, we do look over them at the end of each of our webinars and use that to help inform the way that we're doing things going forward. Don't forget to register for next week's webinar. The link will come straight to your inbox this afternoon for those who are attending, and our absentees will get a link as well. And that's building long-term business resilience in terms of budgets, business structure, farm management and succession planning. So please take the opportunity to register for that one if that's of interest to you. And importantly, the Back to Business webinars are also produced as a podcast, and we're really quite pleased to see that the number of listens to our podcasts have started jumping away in the last few weeks. So if you do like to receive your information via a podcast, or you know somebody who does, then jump onto wherever you get your podcast and search Back to Business and subscribe, and then that will automatically drop into your little podcast folder automatically once they're uploaded. So again, to all of our attendees, thanks for your time today. Thanks again, Hamish, for your time and for your really valuable presentation. So on behalf of Meat and Livestock Australia, Australian Wool Innovation, AWI Sheep Connect New South Wales, Integrity Systems Company, New South Wales DPI, Local Land Services and New South Wales Farmers, best wishes and very good afternoon to you all. Look forward to catching up with you next week. Thanks and bye for now.